Well, I'm not going to read this morning because there are a couple of chapters involved, but I want to just talk briefly about something that I think is a very fundamental question for all of us, and it's who's really in charge of our lives at the end of the day, when it's all said and done? Who's really in charge? It's a fundamental question, and it's relevant for every stage of life. It doesn't matter what stage you're at. And it's more important than involvement in any career. It's more important than the person you marry. It's more important than your involvement in church or anything else. It's a very real question. And in fact, the way we will all answer that question by the way we live. Right? The way we live will answer that question as to who's in charge. And there are really very few options. It's either we're totally in charge, I am totally in charge of my life with no need of outside help, or I submit to the eternal God who knows more about me and knows more about my affairs than anybody else. The way we live our lives is extremely important. You may have heard the story. The captain of a ship looked into the dark night and saw faint lights in the distance. Immediately, he told his signalman to send a message. Alter your course 10 degrees south. Promptly, a return message was received. Alter your course 10 degrees north. The captain was angry. His command had been ignored. So he sent a second message. Alter your course 10 degrees south. I am the captain. Another message was received. Alter your course 10 degrees north. I am Seaman Third Class Jones. And immediately the captain sent a third message, knowing the fear it would evoke. He said, alter your course 10 degrees south. I am a battleship. And then the reply came, alter your course 10 degrees north. I'm a lighthouse. Who's really in charge? So the question we all have to ask is this. This Christian walk, is it all mere talk? What is it that really matters? Who is really in charge at the end of the day? We sing about faith. We sing about trust. We sing about obedience. But so often when the crunch comes, we're waver and we're afraid. We're fearful. The real test of my Christianity, the real test of my belief in God, is whether I can live it out in the harsh realities of the real world. And I suppose the one question that I want to ask this morning and use a biblical character to illustrate is this. Can we recklessly abandon ourselves to the Lord of the universe, who knows more about us and knows more about our future than anyone on the planet ever could or ever will? Come on, now, isn't that the real question when it comes to being a believer? But you know, we all wonder how we fit in. We all wonder, when I was growing up, the big thing was finding the will of God. What's the will of God for my life? I'm not so sure that it's changed much. There's some things about every generation that pretty much stay the same. I mean, we're into the high-tech world of social internet or networking and so on. Now, but really the needs are basically the same. Can't even get the terms right? But two things. What career will I have and who will I marry? And I'm not sure which one came first. Probably the other one came first. But these were the issues. Where will I fit in? What's my destiny? What am I here for? Does my life have any significance? This morning I want to tell you that you do have a destiny. Young person, you belong to something wonderful. And that sense of destiny, that sense of belonging to something powerful needs to override every decision you make in life. You see, salvation, and we have a very narrow view of salvation. Salvation is is a package deal. It's more than simply I came to Christ 10 years ago at a youth convention or a youth camp, gave my life to Christ. It's much bigger than that. God essentially has made a covenant with you. And it really goes like this. If you will believe me, if you will follow me, if you will accept my provision for you, I will be your God. And I will lead you and I will guide you. One of the things that's really impacted my life over the years since I was a teenager is this, is the knowledge that somehow Jesus loves me personally. And I needed to hear that. I grew up in a very small town where, we didn't move around much. We didn't get outside much in my earliest recollection. We were basically isolated. But to understand that somehow Jesus loved me personally, I want to tell you, and this is what struck me. If Jesus cares for sparrows and lilies and somehow has a number on the hairs of your head, don't you think that he really cares about the details of your life? That's biblical. That's true. He's drafted a blueprint, just your fit. God has his own global positioning system and knows exactly where you are located this morning. Because the psalmist said this, the steps of a good man or a good woman are ordered by the Lord, Psalm 37, and he delights in his way. Can you say amen to that? Every one of you has a destiny, has significance. And it doesn't matter how difficult the world may seem and how difficult the problems may seem. I tell you this morning, and I want to say it again, God is, and I was just impacted by this morning, and I'm thinking, God is just as concerned about this generation as he was about my generation when I was their age. Can somebody say amen to that? Just as concerned with it. Now, we can learn some big lessons from biblical characters. Even some of the good ones sometimes made some mistakes. This might give some comfort to you. I want to talk this morning briefly about Abram before he was called Abraham. Now, Abram and God had a long-standing relationship. As you know, he was called the friend of God. That's how we get that song we sing, I am a friend of God. Abraham was called a friend of God. In Genesis chapter 12, I'm going to skip through several scriptures here. Genesis chapter 12, 1-3 says this. The Lord said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So he's told to leave his country, his name will be great, and he would be a blessing. And if you go on to 13, verses 14 to 17, it reads this. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, lift up your eyes from where you are and to look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the land, length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. And so he's making this amazing promise to Abraham that his descendants are going to be like the dust. And the dust of the earth, you're going to be the father of many nations. He makes this everlasting covenant to him. He unfolds this covenant and gives him more information as he moves along. Now, there comes a point, though, in which Abram, as much as he was a friend of God, and as much as his faith was counted as righteousness, does waver, and he's not able to wait for God, and he makes a move that cost him dearly. All right, see if I can get through these 4 points quickly. Number one, God's will for you is still valid even when evidence is absent. Okay? At some point, even though Abram had been given all of these promises that he would be given the land, his descendants would be like the dust of the earth, and later on, he shows them the stars. God shows them the stars and says they'll be like the stars in the sky. Somehow, Abram still has this, occasional fear. In chapter 15 and 1, God says to him, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Now, somehow, Abram must have been having some doubts, because in order for God to say, do not be afraid, there must have been some fear that set in somewhere. He says, don't be afraid. I am your shield and your exceeding great reward. But somehow, Abram, as we approach into this chapter in chapter 16, is beginning to fear for the final outcome. How will this happen? I'm an old man. Sarah's an old woman. How could it ever take place? Verse 2, but Abram said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? I mean, how can you help me? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. In other words, my estate is going to go to my servant. I don't have a son. But the promise is clear. And God takes him out and shows him, count the stars if you can. That's what your offspring will be like. But there's nothing to show. There's nothing to see. But somehow, yet, in spite of the fact that God counts Abram's faith as righteousness, humanly speaking, he still has those questions. Verse 8, Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? Now, my point is this. You would almost think, wouldn't you, that once you'd heard from God in a vision, that God said to you, I'm going to make your descendants like the dust on the sand on the seashore, or the dust of the earth, that you would not have any doubts, right? You would not waver. I have heard people say, and some people think that if I could just see one big miracle, I would believe. But you know something? Human nature is so fallen that we have a way of rationalizing everything. We would still find ourselves asking the question, but God came through the last time. Is God really going to come through this time for me? Will it really, really happen? And I tell you, no matter how much you have proven God in the past, it doesn't make you immune to doubt and fear this time, and it happened in that way for Abram. It's human nature, and Satan plays on it every time. Now, so Abram, God tells Abram he's going to he makes this covenant with him, and he's going to seal the covenant. So there was let me tell you briefly, there was an ancient custom back in those days that if a covenant was being made, they would take certain animals, and they would cut them in half, and they would lay them on the ground, and the two people making the covenant would walk through the two parts of the animals, and that would be like sort of like saying, well, that covenant can no more be broken than if you or I could be split in two, or something like that. And so God uses that covenant, but this time, of course, there's nobody else, only Abram there. And so Abram brought the animals, and he cut them in half, and he waited. He's out on the desert sand. There's no other partner there. The vultures come down and try to steal the sacrifice, the animals, and so he drives them away. And then it says that Abram falls into a deep sleep. And when the day is over, an amazing thing happens in verse 17 of chapter 15. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed through the pieces. And so what God is doing, this is a unilateral covenant, and God is now himself passing down through those pieces. This is not a human thing. He is passing down through those pieces, and that covenant cannot possibly be broken. It is God making the covenant. It cannot be broken. And so this morning, let me tell you that even when visible evidence is absent, God, the promises of God are still valid, even in moments when I think I need to see something. Even when the evidence is not there, God's will is still valid. His plan is still on course, and I don't need to interrupt it and make it happen my way. Point number 2. God's will for you requires listening and waiting. And as I said, if God spoke it directly to any of us, over time we would become impatient. And Abram begins to get impatient. How is this going to happen? I'm too old. Sarah's too old. And Sarah's been growing impatient too. And she's probably aware that God has promised this very thing himself. She knows that God has spoken to Abram. She's been with him all along. And in those days, of course, she's impatient, but in those days, bearing children was a sign of giving meaning to the lives of women, as in some sense it is even in our day. She's impatient. And so she begins to suggest that what Abram should do is father a child by her servant Hagar. Now, in that day, that arrangement was not immoral. That was a possible arrangement to provide a childless wife with children. And just listen to verse 1 of chapter 16. Now, Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. Verse 2, so she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Now, you can see this happening, okay? Abram is saying, he knows that he has to have a son, it has to be his, but it doesn't specifically state that it had to be Sarah, had to be the mother. So you can see this human rationality going on. And so she's prepared to make this sacrifice to give up her place as his wife to somebody of lesser rank because she can't see it happening any other way. And she's despairing over the fact that she doesn't have a child. And she doesn't understand how possibly this promise of 25 years or so is going to be fulfilled any other way. You know, maybe Abram, the husband, had a thought pass through his mind. Maybe that's what God meant. Maybe it could be that way. But he dismissed it. He knows that can't be what God meant. That would not be right for Sarah. But now she's making the suggestion, and it's coming from her, and maybe, you know, through all of this frustration and impatience, maybe this is the way it's supposed to be. Maybe it's not such a far-out idea. I mean, how else is it all going to unfold? It's logical, it's good. And apparently, it doesn't say, the Bible doesn't say whether Abram consulted God about it or not. It just seems to have just gone for the plan. Let me tell you that if you are in a state of wavering, any of us this morning, young or old, if you're in a state of wavering in your relationship with God, the slightest temptation or proposal can blow you away. The slightest wave can wash you away. Abram's faith was such that God credited him as righteousness, but it never meant that he would never have doubts. And the same is true for us. He wanted to, somehow, he couldn't see how in the world could happen, so he wanted to impose his timing, his agenda upon God's. Maybe I can help God along a little bit. You ever get the feeling, maybe I can jump in and help God a little bit along with this one. It's a tough thing to say, but sometimes the biggest hindrance to the will of God and God being in charge of your life is yourself getting in the way. We want to speed it up. The Bible doesn't indicate that Abram committed any sin. Doesn't say he committed sin. But we know that it was anything but wise. He just does not wait for God's timing. He's so afraid it might not happen that he bends to the pressure. And he enters into a relationship with Hagar that may not have been contrary to the customs of the nations, but it had nothing to do with the will of God at all. Nothing to do with the will of God. And you know, I believe God in his mercy has ways of getting us back on track. And certainly in Abram's case, it did. Eventually, of course, Sarah did bear a child. But sometimes when we impose our timing and our agenda on God's agenda, we mess up big time. We pay a huge price. Just listen to what the prophet said. Prophet Isaiah, they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Hoping in the Lord, resting in the Lord, being patient. And I think I used the passage last week, Isaiah 55, for your thoughts are not my thoughts. For my thoughts not your thoughts, God says. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. The failure to wait for God to do it. Thirdly, God's will for you can be delayed when rash decisions are made. Now, this doesn't turn out anything like Abram and Sarah thought it would. You read this story for yourself, and I leave you to read it, 15 and 16. It's an amazing story. The relationships in the home begin to break down. This taking matters into their own hands. This peaceful household turns into a nightmare. There's jealousy, there's hatred. And what happens now is that Sarah starts to blame Abram for the mess she's in. She becomes proud and Hagar, in fact, becomes proud. Hagar says in verse 4, when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. In other words, she's saying, I was able to conceive a child and you weren't able to conceive a child. And then Sarah, of course, is smitten by this, and she lays the blame on Abram, and Abram turns to Sarah and says, what can I do? She's in your hands. She's your maidservant. Do what you want with her. And of course, what happens is that this environment gets so bad that Sarah drives Hagar out of the house to support herself and her child. And this is so painful for Abram. He's hurting. He doesn't know how this is going to all shake down now. He's been stung by the bitterness of what Sarah has been saying. He doesn't know what's going to happen to the covenant. We pay an enormous price for blunders when we fail to wait for God. You see, what seems reasonable and logical may not always be the wisest. Abram no doubt thought that this is a good way to make the promise fulfilled. But if you go to Galatians chapter 4, in fact, you will find that this Paul refers to, in chapter 4, verse 22, this maidservant Hagar as representing everything that's of the flesh and everything that's not of the spirit. Everything that's self-effort, everything that's humanly oriented and not oriented to the Spirit of God. The point is this. I use the term, you can actually trip the breaker on the will of God by jumping too fast without waiting upon God. Young people, you live in a world, and we all live in a world now, that's so fast, everything has to be now. You know, like we don't want to line up at McDonald's for our burger any more than 2 minutes. We get frustrated. That's the way the world is. We don't want to wait for anything. But that's not the way God works. God works the way He has always done. His timing is not our timing. And let me tell you, sometimes you may have to wait months and years for the answer to what you've prayed for. But I'm telling you, hang in there and wait for it. Let it happen. Number 4, God's will for you may not always make sense to other people. Now, let me be very careful here. Sometimes friends will tell you, I think this is the way it should be. Even sometimes loved ones who may not be always in sync with God. But I'd be careful with that one. You better listen to your parents lest I get in trouble here. But sometimes your closest friends may tell you they think they know what's best for you, but not necessarily. Not necessarily. In fact, when Jesus told his disciples that he was going to be killed and rise on the third day, do you know what he said? In Mark 8:33, applied to Peter. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." He said, you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. You don't have God's agenda in mind. It's a sobering question. It's a sobering question. So here it is this morning. God's will for you is valid even when evidence is absent. 2, God's will for you requires listening and waiting. 3, God's will for you can be delayed when rash decisions are made. And 4, God's will for you may not always make sense to other people. Well, let me conclude. You say, well, okay, where do I fit into all of this? let me say this morning this. God has made a personal covenant with every one of us this morning. It is not a covenant that says, I will give you a piece of land somewhere, or your descendants will be like the sand on the seashore. Most of us don't want that anyway. Or the stars of the sky. But do you know something? We sang about it this morning. Somewhere around 2,000 years ago, Jesus, the Son of God, willingly offered himself on a cross of Calvary to purchase my salvation, a sacrifice for my sin. He became sin in my place and let me go free. That is a pledge that's irrevocable, a pledge to me. Somebody put it this way. I think it was Tony Campolo years ago said Calvary was like a giant sponge that sucked up every sin on the planet. But somehow that covenant has to become particular to you individually. It becomes particularized in every one of our lives. And he comes to us this morning in this way, young person. He says, I will be with you always. If you will give your life to me, I will be with you always. You know something? I believe today you can still hear the voice of God if you listen closely. Not that God is speaking to you for somebody else as much as God's speaking to you for you. God's speaking to the very depths of your being. Because as I said, if he cares for things that are seemingly so insignificant to us as birds and flowers and hair, he's certainly interested in the details of your life. It's so easy to forget that we trust an omniscient, that is an all-knowing God who knows everything. And you know something, I like to look at it this way. Life is like a parade. From our vantage point, we see only a certain number of floats in that parade. God from above sees the whole parade, sees the front float and the back float. Can you say amen to that? He sees everything that's going on. And God will keep none of us waiting one moment longer than his appointed time. But I can guarantee you that it's not uncommon for faith to be tested. So, young person, if you think your faith is not going to be tested, get used to it. It will be tested. Everybody's faith is tested. It's not easy to watch with God or wait for him. Sometimes it seems so long, but I want to tell you this morning that God's delays are not necessarily God's refusals. God's delays are not necessarily God's refusals. If you've truly given your life to Jesus, if you've truly put your rest in God, not in anything else, in the youth group, in your boyfriend, in your girlfriend, in your job, you know that everything's going to be okay. Waiting. Letting God be in charge. Waiting is not a bad thing. It puts steel into your character. It reinforces you. It's really hard to believe that Abram couldn't wait for God. God had spoken to him so many times. He'd given him this amazing covenant and confirmed it with this incredible revelation of walking through the pieces of the halves of the animals. But how could he not believe? How could he not trust? There were others. We won't go into them this morning, but God told Saul through Samuel, go and kill everything. Wipe out the Amalekites. And Saul decided, well, there's some nice looking sheep and cattle around here. I think I'm going to keep some for myself. To make a long story short, Samuel shows up and Saul says, the Lord bless you, I've carried out the Lord's instructions. But Samuel says, well then, what's this bleating of the sheep I hear? What's this mooing of the cattle I hear? Saul starts to give excuses. Well, the soldiers spared the best to sacrifice to the Lord your God. And stop, Samuel says to Saul, let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. Samuel said, one time you were small even in your own eyes, but you became head of the tribes of Israel. God anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy these wicked people, the Amalekites. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I just kept the best to sacrifice to the Lord. And Samuel says in effect, but this is not what God told you to do. You jumped ahead of God. And listen to what 1 Samuel 15, 22, 23 says. Samuel says, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And so this morning, the Christian walk, young person, the Christian walk means unwavering trust when there's no sign on the horizon, when there's no money in your bank account, when you applied for a job and you didn't get it, when things don't go right and your boyfriend has dumped you, you still gotta trust God anyway. Let me leave some points with you for the final exam. There they are. Number one, don't settle for just what looks good. Hold it for God's best. Number two, maintain a submissive spirit. Submit your heart, submit your mind, submit your will, everything to God. Number three, talk to God every day. Just talk to him. Tell him your fears. Tell him your doubts. Number four, go to the Word. Let the Word be your friend. Number five, don't let those unclean ravens, crows, vultures, whatever they are, take away the sacrifice. They'll fly around you, but drive them away. And number six, don't run too fast. The psalmist said, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Close with this illustration. There was a TV commercial advertising recreation vehicles showing a little girl on her father's shoulders peering up at the stars. And she asked this question. She says, Daddy, who turns out the stars at night? And his answer is, why, he says, honey, they're always on. Well then, how come we can't see them? Let me tell you this morning, the promises of God are always turned on 24/7, night and day, even if you can't see them and even if the evidence is not there. They are always turned on. We simply lose sight of them because of the clutter and the busyness of life and because of our human nature that is so easily given to wavering and doubt. My encouragement to you this morning, every one of us, is hold on, wait. God will come through for you. What you're praying for, the will of God in your life, that career that you want to go into, maybe that call to missions, maybe that call to ministry, maybe something like that this morning. I want to tell you this morning, God will come through for you. Wait, rest in him. Listen to his voice. Don't jump too fast. Don't mess it up. Let it happen in his time. In his time. Would you stand this morning?